Hello, my name is Kashdeep Singh from Group F. Today my group and I will be presenting a presentation on the case RV Ron Engineering and Construction Ltd. My team members are Lapri Singh, Anmoljeet Singh, Akashdeep Singh, Laprit Kaur, Parvjot Singh. Now let's begin with the introduction to case. The name of case is RV Ron Engineering and Construction Ltd. The case was filed in Supreme Court of Canada in 1981. The parties involved plaintiff and defendant. Plaintiff, the Government of Ontario, and the defendant, Ron Engineering and Construction Ltd. Context: the case arises from a dispute over the legal consequences of government tendering process for construction project in Ontario. Ron Engineering submitted a bid in response to the government's invitation, but later learned that the government decided not to accept any of the submitted tenders, including their core issues, whether submitting a tender in the response to an invitation constitutes a building offer creating enforceable obligation on the part of the government to either accept or reject the tender. The case on the application of the government cancellation of the tender process after bids has been received.
Hello, here I am talking about the facts of the case. Tender invitation. The Government of Ontario invented tender for the construction project. Ron Engineering among the companies submitted a bid in response. Submission by Ron Engineering. Ron Engineering tender outlining the price and terms for the project responding directly to the government invitation. Government cancellations. After receiving all bids, the government decided to cancel the entry tender process, including Ron Engineering bid. No contract was awarded by any of the tenders, sparking the legal dispute. Ron Engineering lawsuit. Ron Engineering filed a lawsuit claiming the government had breached contract obligations by cancelling the process after bid was submitted. Here I am talk about the history. Trail court ruling. The trail court ruling for and favor raw engineering starting the submission and trend create a binding offer and the government was obligated to either accept or reject it. The court found the government cancellation of the process to be a breach of contract. Appealed to the Supreme Court. The government of Ontario appealed, arguing that the tender was an invitation to treat rather than an offer, thus not creating binding obligations. Supreme Court rules. The Supreme Court task was to determine whether the submission of the tender constituted an offer and whether the government cancellation breached any contractual obligation.
Hi, my name is Prabhjot Singh, and today I'm discussing about legal issues, nature of tender submission, whether the submission of tender creates a vending offer or is merely an invitation to treat, obligation to accept or reject, whether government is obligated to accept or reject a tender once submitted, breach of contract by cancellation, whether the government cancellation of the tender process after submission constitute a breach of contract. Thank you. Hi, my name is Prabhu Singh. Today I am discussing about holding Supreme Court decision. The court ruled in favor of Ron Engineering, concluding that submitting a tender constitute an offer, creating a vending contractual obligation. The government was found to have breached of contractual obligation by cancelling the tender process after receiving the bid. The ruling clarified that the tender process should be treated as an offer that once submitted to a tender cannot be abrogated rejected without consequences. Thank you.
Now I'm going to talk about legal reasoning and analysis. The first one is tender as a binding offer. When someone submits a tender, the court says it's serious or legally binding offer, not just an invitation to negotiate. The second one is implied contract. By submitting a tender, a contract is automatically created between the binder and the government. This means the government has a duty to fairly consider that they have to accept it or reject it. And third one is good faith requirement. The government act honestly and fairly. It can't just cancel the tender process for no good reasons after tender haven't submitted. Moving further to the roles of tender. The first one is invitation to tender as an offer. The code determines that when the government called for tender, it was actually making an offer rather than just inviting submissions. By submitting a tender, a binding offer was created, and the good faith had a duty to accept or decline it in a good faith. And the second one is obligation of the government. The code highlights that the government couldn't just cancel the process after receiving tender, as doing so would compromise the integrity of the entire procedure. Why inviting tenders, the government had implicitly process to fair orderly process, honoring the terms of the information.
Legal precedents and principles. Journal principle in contract law. The ruling reinforced the key contract principle, including the distinction between an invitation to treat and offer. The court emphasized that tender submission and offer trust, thus triggering contractual obligation. Precedents in tendering law. The case built on previous legal precedents relating to tender process and the enforcement of contract based on tender submission. The court reflects two legal precedents on offer and acceptance, underscoring that the submission of a tender is akin to make an offer. Impact on tendering process. Binding nature of tender submission. The ruling establishing that tender submission once made are legally binding offers. The case clarified the legal obligation of both parties and tenders in the tendering process. Implication for government and contractors. The government and other contracting authorities must respect the integrity of the tendering process and act in a good faith. Contractors submitting the binds can rally to the idea that their tender is a legal binding offer.
Hello, I am going to discuss the questions related to this case. First is, does the submission of a tender create a legally binding offer? And the answer is yes. The court ruled that the submission of a tender is a binding offer. The tender creates an obligation on the part of government to either accept or reject the offer, not just an invitation to threat. The second question is, was the government required to accept or reject the tender? The answer is yes. The court held that the government, having invited tender, was obligated to either accept or reject the tender in good faith and could not cancel the process after submission were made. And the third question is, does the cancellation of the tender process after submission constitute a breach of contract? And the answer is yes. The court concluded that the cancellation of the tender process amounted to a breach of contract, as the government had implicitly promised to adhere to the terms of the process once tender were submitted. Finally, the conclusion of this case. Summary of the ruling. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the submission of a tender is a binding offer, which creating enforceable obligation for both the government and the contractor. The impact on tendering process. The case clarified that the government must either accept or reject tenders in good faith, protecting the integrity of the process. Long-term legal precedent. The decision set an important legal precedent for future cases involving public tenders, ensuring more accountability in government procurement. At the end of the presentation, I would like to say thank you to all, and I hope you really like the presentation, And this is all the research me and my teammates made on this topic.